Concept 56.2 says population conservation focuses on population size, genetic diversity, and critical habitat. If you are a biologist who focuses on conservation, you kind of have two ways of going about your job, or kind of two different methods that conservation biologists often follow. So we're going to look at those two main approaches. One of them is called the small population approach. The other is the declining population approach. The small population approach focuses on small populations and the various processes that make them become extinct. So it focuses on, say, a population that is already sort of in a danger area because it's so small, and it focuses on the factors that may lead to the extinction of that species. So they have something that scientists call, conservation biologists call, the extinction vortex. A small population is prone to inbreeding because there's just not that many members to choose from, and genetic drift as its genetic pool shrinks in size, and this leads to what they call an extinction vortex. The key factor driving the extinction vortex is the loss of genetic variation necessary to enable evolutionary responses to environmental change. So when your gene pool is so small, remember, you don't have as many possible alleles to pull from. Well, that means you will not have the ability to evolve traits as quickly as others to adapt to changes in the environment. And so you end up with inbreeding, where closely related individuals begin to breed together, and that further diminishes the genetic pool. It further diminishes the genetic variability. Small populations and low genetic diversity do not always lead to extinction, but it's a common theme in creatures who have become extinct. A good example in the textbook is that northern elephant seals were once hunted by humans almost to extinction. They numbered only about 20 in the 1890s. In other words, there were only about 20 of these northern elephant seals. That is all that existed in the 1890s, and that population has rebounded to about 150,000 now. That doesn't mean that they didn't face a lot of challenges, and that doesn't mean they wouldn't have been better off with a larger population size. If you were to look at these 150,000 creatures today, you would still see that they are very much alike. They don't have a lot of genetic diversity, but they were able to hang on and make it. And then over time, as the number of creatures grows and time passes, you're going to begin to develop further genetic diversity through mutations and the like. So it looks like at 150,000 they should be able to make it, as long as we don't do anything, as long as human activity doesn't disrupt that process. But small populations and this extinction vortex oftentimes does lead to the loss of the creatures for good. Here's kind of a pictogram to kind of show what we're talking about. When you have a small population, if you'll think back to some of the chapters where we talked about genetic drift and go back and look at what genetic drift is, you have genetic drift and then you have inbreeding. That's going to lead to a loss of genetic variability. That's going to reduce the species as a whole, their ability to adapt over time. So you're going to have higher mortality, lower reproduction, which is going to give you a smaller population. Well, guess what? You start all over again. Now you've got an even smaller population, which is going to lead to more inbreeding and more genetic drift and a loss of genetic variability, and this is just going to spiral until suddenly the species is extinct, no longer there. That's what they mean by the extinction vortex. In your textbook, they study a case study of the greater prairie chicken. This is actually a case study that we looked at. I can't remember if it was early this semester or last semester when we were talking about genetic variability, but this population of greater prairie chickens was very small because a lot of their habitat had been wiped out and there wasn't a lot of genetic diversity, and their population was dwindling. So what the scientists did is they brought in greater prairie chickens from other parts of the state, other parts of the country, to allow for some greater genetic variability in the breeding population, and that helped. That caused the population to rebound. And so that shows us that that low genetic variation was leading to some susceptibility in evolution over time, and so if you add in some genetic variability, it certainly helped. So here you have the number of the male birds of this particular species, and their number drop, and then they brought in other prairie chickens with greater genetic diversity and kind of mixed them in with the population, and that helped. That greater genetic diversity allows these birds to adapt and evolve to changes in their environment, which strengthens the species as a whole, and you can see the numbers have risen since that time. When you have a shrinking population and you have this extinction vortex, you finally reach a point, what's called the minimum viable population size. The minimum viable population size is what is the bare minimum number of creatures of this species that it takes for the species to survive. And that depends on a lot of factors that affect the chance of survival. That depends on the ecosystem available, that depends on genetic variability, things of the like. Here in this picture you can see the last surviving thylacine. Thylacine was a marsupial, so this was in Australia, New Zealand, that area. It sort of looks like a wolf, what we might consider like a coyote here in North America, but it was a marsupial. So think about like a kangaroo or a possum. Most all of the creatures there in Australia were marsupial, and this is sort of like a dog or wolf-like version of a marsupial, but they got to the point where there were so few of them that they reached this minimum viable population size, and then below that they weren't able to survive. And there's some, it's kind of weird to see not in our lifetime, it was before you and I were born, but in the modern era, pictures and video of this creature. So here's a Wikipedia article, and you can even go and find video clips of the last remaining ones that lived in a zoo in Britain, I believe. And to think that their numbers just dwindled to the point to where their population could no longer continue. So they dropped below this minimum viable population size. If we really want to study what it takes to keep this species going, we look at what's called effective population size. That's kind of a number that's a subset of the minimum viable population size, because not all creatures in a population are breeders. Some of them are too young to breed, some of them are too old to breed, some of them are not healthy enough to breed. So the sheer numbers of creatures in the population don't tell us everything we need to know. We really need to know what is the effective population size, which would basically be of all the creatures that are alive, which ones can actually have babies and are breeding. That's what we really need to know, because if the species is to survive, we're most concerned about which ones are creating babies. So we look at what's called the effective population size. I'm not going to make you memorize this formula, but there is a mathematical formula for determining effective population size, and it is a combination of the number of males and females that breed successfully. So if you know the number of males and females that successfully breed in the population, you get the effective population size, and that's a subset under the minimum viable population. Viability analysis is used to predict a population's chances for survival over a particular time interval. So the higher this number, the greater chance of survival. The lower this number, obviously, the less chance of survival, the greater chance of extinction. Your textbook uses a case study of the analysis of grizzly bear population. One of the first population viability analysis was conducted as part of this long-term study of grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park, and it was estimated that a population of 100 bears would have a 95% chance of surviving about 200 years. So this grizzly population is about 400, but the NE, which is the effective population size, was about 100. So that means the conservation biologists said, okay, within the Yellowstone National Park there's a population total of about 400 grizzly bears, but only about a quarter of those are actually breeding males and females, and so they felt that there's a 95% chance of the species surviving at least 200 years with that number of population. So you can look on your textbook page 1246 and 1247 to see further details. Now this is only a small portion of the puzzle, because you have to also think about habitat and things like that. So if humans, this is in the national park, so you would hope that habitat wouldn't be lost, but if humans were to suddenly decide to open up half of the park for the building of condos or resort hotels, well then that would have an effect also. But this was just based on the number of breeding males and females and the analysis of their effective population. Here's a cool picture of the tracking that was done. They would dart these bears, tranquilize them, put radio collars on them, and they would be able to track them and learn more about their population and movement. The Yellowstone grizzly population has low genetic variability compared with other grizzly populations, and that's because Yellowstone is sort of an island of ecosystem, and it's somewhat surrounded on some parts by civilization, and so the bears that are within this park, they don't have the free range necessarily that other bears maybe say in the wilds of Alaska do. So there is decreased genetic variability. There's a little bit of inbreeding that goes on amongst these bears. Introducing individuals from other populations might be helpful, just like it was with the prairie chickens. If we were to catch a few wild grizzlies up in Alaska and bring them down to Yellowstone, that would bring in new genetic diversity, and that might actually help strengthen the population there in Yellowstone overall. The second approach to take in conservation biology is not the small population approach, but what we call the declining population approach. And this one focuses on threatened and endangered populations that show a downward trend, regardless of population size. So you may still have a large number of these creatures, but something is happening and the number is shrinking. The emphasis here is not on the sheer number of creatures, but on the environmental factors that cause the decrease in the numbers. And your textbook kind of discusses this and describes it very well. It says the distinction between a declining population, which is not always small, and a small population, which is not always declining, is less important than the different priorities of the two approaches. So the small population approach emphasizes smallness itself as the ultimate cause of a population's extinction, especially through the loss of genetic diversity. In contrast, the declining population approach emphasizes the environmental factors that caused a population to decline in the first place. So in this approach, we're going to look at the environmental factors that lead to this downward trend of population size. If you're studying a species in this way, you're going to go through a couple of steps. First, you're going to confirm that the population is in decline. Are the numbers going down? Then you're going to study the species' natural history. You're going to develop some hypotheses for all possible causes of the decline. You're going to try to test those hypotheses in order of likeliness, and you're going to apply the results of the diagnosis to manage for recovery, to try to get those numbers back up on the rise. I won't spend a lot of time on the case study here because you can look at it in your textbook on page 1248, but the case study here is about the decline of the red-cockaded woodpecker, and one of the problems is of habitat loss. This woodpecker lives right here in the pine forests of East Texas, deep East Texas, and Southeast Texas, and these woodpeckers require forests with very little undergrowth. But a lot of man activity, logging, agriculture, fire suppression have reduced the suitable habitat. So this is the type of forest that this red-cockaded woodpecker prefers. This is not what they will usually hang out in. So this is usually mature pine forests, although these pine trees are pretty small, so I don't know how mature they are. But they like this low undergrowth type forest, and it's difficult to find that now because a lot of man's activities. So basically in the textbook, again, you can read that if you want the details, but what they did is they modified the habitat. So by modifying the habitat, they showed what affected this particular bird's population change over time. In the case of this particular bird, it's not only habitat destruction that caused the problem, but it is sort of a societal way in which the birds raise each other, or in which they live. And so if you read in the textbook, it talks about how the scientists went in and they made little holes in the trees to up the number of cavities available to them, and that assisted the number in rising. So again, I won't go into a lot of detail. Certainly if you want to look at that, you can, but this was a good example of this case study of declining population approach, where they were trying to figure out why is the number decreasing and what can be done to rectify that. Finally, when you're studying conservation biology and you're thinking about what you can do to assist populations of species, the problem is this is not just cut and dried. You don't just say, oh, well, here's what we can do to help these creatures, so we should just do it. There's conflicting demands. Conserving species often requires resolving conflicts between habitat needs of endangered species and human demands. You hear this in the news all the time. I mean, there may be an endangered species, but what if that land needed for the endangered species is prime land that someone wants to build a mall on, or wants to build a new housing subdivision on? How do you balance the needs of humans and the needs of other living creatures? That's a problem that it starts off as a biology problem, but it ends up as a social problem and a political problem. It gets into all the other aspects of our life as humans. For example, in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, habitat preservation for many species is at odds with timber and mining industries. If you want to protect certain species, you have to go against the needs and desires of timber and mining industries and home building industries and things of that nature. Managing habitat for one species might have a positive or negative effect on other species as well. it's not just conflict with mankind, sometimes it's conflict with other species. A great example is reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone Park in the news over the last perhaps 10 or 20 years. This has been a kind of a controversial thing. The farmers and ranchers that live around Yellowstone Park, they don't want wolves reintroduced because those wolves could potentially attack their sheep or cattle. And then if you do introduce wolves into the park, that is certainly going to affect species that already live there. So how do you balance all of these conflicting needs? That's really where it kind of goes from being biology to also including everything else that makes up mankind's life, politics and all those other things. So it gets really sticky really fast. Let's take a break right there. We'll come back with Concept 56.3, and it talks about landscape and regional conservation helping sustain biodiversity, and we'll move on.